Hey, I'm going to do a test run on a talk I'm giving later today at the PAML Pacific Ancient Modern Language Association conference entitled Footnotes to Hesiod. And you can probably see that this is an allusion to Whitehead in his somewhat famous quote that the safest general characterization of Western philosophy is that it is a series of footnotes to Plato. And I want to extend this idea because when we look at Plato and certainly texts like the Republic and the Timaeus and the Symposium and others, we see that his philosophy, Plato's philosophy, is really a series of footnotes to Hesiod. so let's go all the way back to what we could say is probably the dawn of Western literature and perhaps even Western philosophy. And this is exactly what Aristotle says, that Hesiod is really the first philosopher. Everybody thinks of Thales as the first philosopher. Certainly he's the first natural philosopher and someone who's investigating these things within the world. But in a real sense, Hesiod, who came 200 years before Thales, was doing philosophy, and that he had a massive impact across Greek philosophy. And, Aristotle says he's the first one to have theorized about matter and form. And he says that in the Theogony, for instance, that at the beginning there is chaos, this opening of stuff coming into being, which is matter. And you have Eros, the god of love. And this god is in charge of movement and is the motive cause which brings about form and order in the world. So I'm not going to focus on the Theogony today. I'm going to focus on the works and days primarily. And I'm going to try to argue that there is a very deeply philosophical side to this poetry, and that we see in Plato his method of philosophical poetry at work, continuing at work within the Platonic text. And what this boils down to really is insights into the human condition, into the psyche, and into the cosmos itself as metaphysical understanding of the cosmos as an ordered universe. Now, I'm going to focus almost entirely on the works and days, and so I will give a brief outline of this text. The works and days is persuasive. It's a persuasive text. Hesiod is trying to persuade his brother to be just. And there's this whole backstory that his brother, they each got half of the inheritance, and his brother stole his half of the inheritance and I think squanders it. So it's a hortatory text. He is attempting to exhort his brother to pursue justice and to give up his unjust tendencies. And to do this, he provides a series of images. And these images, what I want to argue is that they work very much like the series of images that we get in the Platonic texts at a number of different times, but especially the allegory of the cave and the simile of the sun and the divided line. These are three images that work in conjunction with each other. And what I think is so striking is that the way that these images work is that you cannot overlay one on top of the other. They're not perfectly representative such that we can accumulate them and add them up and create an argument from them. They have inconsistencies between them. Each one kind of shows a certain aspect of what is trying to be talked about, but does so in a limited way, in a way that isn't complete. And therefore, we need a series of them. And these images cannot be taken dogmatically. They're illuminating of certain ideas, but they are also sort of insufficient. And we see that Hesiod actually corrects himself, for example, from the Theogony to the works and days. So, and this goes back to the old idea that The Muses provide us with both truth and falsehood. And this is an idea that comes up again in Plato, and that is central to the idea of the poetic and mythic elements of philosophy. And again, Plato insists that we cannot get rid of the mythic aspect of philosophy. So we get this series of images. We get the Pandora myth, which involves Prometheus and Epimetheus. We get this myth of the metals, as it's called, the creation and degradation of humans. And then we get a series of insights about the nature of the psyche and of justice. And again, these are sometimes what we could call precepts, sort of wise phrases that are quotable, and sometimes in myths and in allegories. And basically, again, there is this core insight that we are moving towards, which is basically justice. And the goal is to not give a definition of it, not say what it is in plain language, because that's impossible, not because it's undesirable. And the way to go about doing this is to provide a series of images that give us a certain... we leap from the content of the ideas, from the images themselves, to the insight. So Plato has a very mixed view of Hesiod. There's a book out called Plato and Hesiod, and it teases out all of these complexities, which are very wide-ranging. There's a lot of ways in which Plato is adopting ideas from Hesiod, and there's plenty of instances where he's criticizing Hesiod. So I think one really clear way of stating this is that Hesiod is a good philosopher in the fact that he uses poetry as philosophy, but he's a bad theologian insofar as he portrays the gods as, flawed with morally and in terms of knowledge and understanding. So he borrows a lot from Hesiod. He borrows mythic elements. He oftentimes changes these or alters them. And, both Plato and Hesiod are synthesizers. They are thinkers who took in many already existing ideas, already existing myths, and put them together in a unique way, gave it their own spin. And so a lot of these myths that come from Hesiod, that we get through Hesiod and through Plato, weren't, authored by Hesiod, but are transmitted by Hesiod. And above all, Plato borrows this method of putting together images in order to illuminate something that is ineffable, something that cannot be put into words. And I'm thinking here through Henri Bergson as well, as I always am. And in his text, An Introduction to Metaphysics, he outlines this exact methodology. And we see this also in Plotinus, for instance, when he tries to understand different vicissitudes and affects within the soul, that we can use a series of metaphors. Each one alone is insufficient, or a series of images or metaphors, but which work together and which sort of launch us into an insight that we form on our own that isn't reducible to what language is telling us. So anyways, this is the core method that I want to keep coming back to. And just a couple other major themes that Plato clearly is footnoting Hesiod on is, first of all, this idea of eris and eros, which eris means strife and eros means love. And in the pre-Socratic philosophy, this tension between strife and love recurs again and again throughout different thinkers. And Hesiod says in the beginning of the Works and Days that, in fact, there are two forms of strife. And this is exactly what we see in the Symposium, where there are two forms of eros. So this idea that there is like a sort of good and bad version of strife comes up. And it's clear that, in a way, Plato does agree with the idea that there's a good strife. So the bad strife is quarreling and shameless advantage seeking. But the good strife is this motivation that we get when we see somebody outperforming us that motivates us to do better and to push ourselves further. And so this doubling of the gods is a theme that comes up again and again in the symposium and other places as well. And I think that one of the biggest, most undeniably important aspects of Plato's view of Hesiod and his adoption of Hesiodic ideas is what I would say that justice is a style of being. And here I'm thinking alongside Merleau-Ponty and his idea of style. Style is something that is very difficult to describe and to define. And when we do describe it and define it, it only makes sense to someone who has experienced the style in question. So justice is like this. It has many aspects. It can surprise us and show up in new ways, but we can detect its style of being in the sense that it takes one to know one. If you have achieved justice within your life and within your habituation, then you can identify justice. But if you have inculcated vices and injustice, then you will be ignorant of the nature of justice. So it is this style of being that is lived, that is part of our own being. And this is connected to the idea of a mystery of existence. And here again, I'm pulling on Merleau-Ponty as well as Gabriel Marcel. And a mystery is like a problem. So philosophy deals with problems. But the problems that it deals with are ones that we are caught up in. They're existentially deep. The way that I engage with philosophy, I cannot extricate that from the problems of philosophy. And okay, so the one idea I really want to drive in, I think this is the really original insight that I have on this text, is this play on words that is going on between the pithos, which is a fermentation jar, and pytho, which is the verb for persuade, and a series of metaphors that circle on this. So he says multiple times throughout the text, and again, it's a hortatory text to his brother Perseus. He says, store this up in your heart. And the idea there is that we put it in the heart, right? We let it ferment, and we let it persuade us as it sits in our heart. And again, heart means soul, it means mind. It is the sort of seat of moral feeling. The jar, you put, the wine or the cabbage or whatever in it. You close it up, you let it do its thing, and at the right time, if you open it up, then you're good. And this is the central image with the Pandora myth. Pandora's box is actually a mistranslation. It's Pandora's pithos, Pandora's fermentation jar. So, and this really gets at this temporalization of the psyche. We make provisions for the future. We allow into our heart what will improve and make us better. And this idea from Pandora's jar myth is that the only thing left in the jar is hope, right? Stuck under the lid. And later in the poem, he says that this is all that humans have left. We live in a time where people are lying to each other, where justice is injustice, where it pays more to be unjust than to be just. And these are themes that come up in Republic Book 1. And this idea that evil done to others contaminates one's own heart. It turns it cold, it spoils it, right? So Hesiod is really I would say the first continental philosopher. He is the first thinker of affect theory and virtue ethics, at least in the written tradition, we'll say. And his greatest contribution is in moral psychology. And I'm not saying that we should accept all of his morals. There is a lot there that we should reject. Colonization is part of his thinking, and slavery and misogyny. There's plenty to critique and throw out. But he also is the first one in the written tradition to look deeply at these affects. Strife. What is the role of habit in life? How do we acquire virtues? And how do our actions end up corrupting our intentions and spoiling our jar, right, our heart, and the idea of hubris. And he looks again and again at the idea of shameless advantage seeking. So that's a place where I definitely think we can find resonance with Hesiod. And he has many deep insights into the temporalities of the human condition. And what we see is that these are overlapping, inextricable, and oftentimes in tension with each other. So this fermentation analogy points at the kairos element of time, which is the opportune moment. You know, if you put your stuff in your fermentation jar and you open it too early, well, it's not ready yet. And if you just try and close it back up, oftentimes it will have been contaminated by being opened too early. And if you open it too late, obviously it's also spoiled. So there's this question of the right temporality of when to open things, when to do things. And the whole third half of the dialogue or of the poem is about days, about the right time to do everything. And to connect this idea of the fermentation jar to Whitehead, who I obviously used as my title, there's this idea that subjectivity forms by creating an interiority that ferments and then is opened back out to existence. And he has this idea that to the objective existence, that an actual occasion, this is one of his famous terms, is the subjectivizing of the entire universe into a enclosed process that then becomes public again. And that reality is this pulsing of private and public. And I think that this subjectivity view of the heart and what we carry and how it changes our relation to the future is beautifully described in Hesiod's analogy here. Now we also have a temporality of degradation, this, myth of the metals and of necessity. And necessity is paired with fate, right? This inability to outstrip the degradation, the falling apart of reality. We also have a temporality of development and work. This idea of habit and virtue being a difficult road, more difficult than the road to vice, but it's a steep hill, he says. But once you're up there, then things become easy. This idea is, again, a kind of insight into the nature of habit, such that we have to put effort into developing ourselves, but once we have, they become automatic. And this links to another type of temporality, which is the mythic temporality, which is non-linear and epochal. And we see that Hesiod kind of jumps around in the storyline, and if we try to project that storyline into a linear temporality, there are inconsistencies, and scholars have looked into this, especially with the theogony. And the point is not whether or not we can create a history out of the mythic. The point is that the mythic points to metaphysical questions, and that the epochal points to different dimensions of the human condition that exist simultaneously, but that we cannot overlay onto one another, that we cannot look at all at once. It's too complex and too inconsistent. But those inconsistencies and paradoxes are part of our predicament, we could say. And we have also the temporality of foresight and hindsight. This is a huge element within the story. Epimetheus and Prometheus mean literally foresight and hindsight. And then lastly, I would say this idea of inheritance. And inheritance, comes in the beginning of the poem. Perseus stole the inheritance, and that's where this starts. But this question of inheritance with Plato is so important, and the Republic starts with this idea of inheritance. And really the question is, how do we inherit a past? How do we take from it what is good and take out of it what is bad? How do we not let it spoil our fermentation? And what do we pass on to the next generation? How can we unlock the philosophical power of poetry and at the same time safeguard against the problems that it brings along with it?